There are some things in this world we were never meant to understand, and yet some of us can't help but try. I was one of them. And now, I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't unhear the things that still whisper to me in the dark. But the worst part? I don't think I'm alone anymore. Welcome to Eerie Short and Scary Stories, where the shadows of stories to tell and the whispers in the dark are never just in your head. If you love unsettling tales that linger long after the screen goes dark, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, if you dare. I never thought I'd hear my grandfather speak of those days. He had always been a quiet man, carrying his past like an old, weathered coat, worn close to the chest, never shared. But that night, as he settled into his chair, the firelight flickering against his face, something in him shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the weight of all the years between then and now. Or maybe he just wanted someone to remember. His voice, frail yet steady, filled the room. "I was young once, you know," he said, almost as if he had to convince himself. "A young man with a wife, a child, and a future I thought I could hold on to. Then the war came." He paused, eyes distant, seeing something I never could. It happened fast. One moment, we were living, really living. I had a small shop, just enough to put food on the table. Your grandmother, God bless her, she was everything to me. And your father, barely a year old, all wide eyes and laughter. That was my world. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a nervous habit I'd never noticed before. Then the soldiers came. One day, they weren't there. The next, they were everywhere. The streets changed. People disappeared. We all knew what was happening, but knowing doesn't mean anything when you can't stop it. I could hear the strain in his voice, the effort it took to pull those words from the past. They came for me first. They didn't care who I was, only that I was strong enough to work. They shoved me onto a train, packed in with men I didn't know, all of us silent, all of us afraid to ask where we were going. Days passed. No food, no water. Just the sound of the wheels on the tracks, dragging us further from everything we knew. His hands curled into fists, knuckles white against the dim light. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to tell her to hold on, to wait for me to... His voice cracked. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. I lost them that day. Or at least, I thought I did. I swallowed hard. I had never seen him like this. So open, so raw. They put us to work in Germany. We weren't prisoners, not officially, but we weren't free either. We labored from dawn to dusk, building things we'd never get to use, working for a war that had already stolen everything from us. Every night, I lay on a cot, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my wife and son were still alive. His gaze shifted to me then, eyes searching, as if he needed me to understand something deeper than words could express. I made a choice. A desperate, impossible choice. I found a way. God knows how, but I did. There were grain shipments leaving for America. Hidden compartments, just big enough for a woman and a child. It wasn't safe. It wasn't guaranteed. But it was the only chance I had to save them. So I sent them away. I sent them across an ocean, praying they'd make it, knowing I might never see them again. The room felt heavier, as if his memories had settled into the walls. I don't know how long I lasted after that. Time stopped meaning anything. I worked. I survived. And then, one day, the war was over. His voice trailed off, leaving only the crackle of the fire between us. I wanted to speak, to say something, but what could I say? I had never imagined him like this, a young man torn from his family, making impossible choices in a world that offered no mercy. He exhaled a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair. It's strange, you know, how a single moment can change everything. One decision, one risk, and suddenly, your entire life takes a different path. I looked at him, This old man who had lived through more than I could ever comprehend. And for the first time, I saw him not just as my grandfather, but as the young man he once was. A man who had lost everything, and somehow, against all odds, found his way back. I don't think my grandfather ever meant to tell me about Buchenwald. The other stories, the ones about the war, about losing his family, about sending my grandmother and father away in a crate of grain, those had come first. Painful, yes, but spoken with the distance of time, like scars that had long since hardened. But this was different. This wasn't just loss. This was something else entirely. He had gone quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, lost in a place I couldn't follow. Then, almost too soft to hear, he said, "They took me to a camp." A camp. That's the word he used. As if that word could ever contain the truth of what he was about to say. The train stopped in the middle of the night. We didn't know where we were. The doors opened, and the cold hit first. Then the voices, shouting, barking orders. "Move. Faster. Faster." We stumbled out, half dead already from the journey. The ones who couldn't walk anymore, they didn't make it past the doors. He swallowed hard, his hands pressing against the arms of his chair as if he could still feel the weight of that moment. They gave us numbers. That was the first thing. Names didn't matter. Past didn't matter. You were what they decided you were. And if you weren't useful, you didn't stay long. I listened, barely breathing. He had never spoken of this before. Never. Buchenwald. The name came out like something bitter on his tongue. That's where they sent me. A place that should not have existed. A place no human mind should have been capable of creating. He paused, as if deciding whether to go on. But something in him had already cracked open, and there was no stopping it now. The first thing you noticed was the smell. You think you know what death smells like? You don't. Not until you've stood there, with the smoke rising from the chimneys, filling your lungs until you taste it. That's when you know. That's when you understand that this isn't just about killing. It's about something worse. His fingers clenched. There were men there, if you could call them that anymore. Skin stretched so thin you could see their bones. Eyes that had stopped seeing. They moved like ghosts, waiting for the day their bodies would give up, too. Some of them didn't wait. Some of them found the fences, the ones lined with wire that hummed in the night. A few seconds of pain, and then it was over. I felt sick. I wanted him to stop, but at the same time, I needed him to keep going. The guards didn't care. They didn't see us as people. We were something less. And when you believe that nothing standing in front of you is real, that its suffering doesn't matter, then anything is possible. Anything. He didn't describe what anything meant. He didn't have to. I lasted longer than I should have. I don't know why. I wasn't strong. I wasn't clever. I just didn't die. And then one day, something happened. His voice changed, just slightly. A shift. A hesitation. There was an officer. I don't know his name. Never wanted to. He wasn't like the others. He watched me. I could feel it. Every time I looked up, his eyes were already there, studying me like I was some puzzle he needed to solve. I frowned. Why? Why would a Nazi officer care about a prisoner? What could he possibly want? I didn't know either, my grandfather said. But I was going to find out. At first, my grandfather thought it was a mistake. The officer, this man in his crisp uniform, with his clean hands and boots that had never waded through the filth of the camp, was watching him. Not in the way the others did, not like he was something to be discarded at the first sign of weakness, but in a way that felt almost curious. It made no sense. There was no reason for an SS officer to pay any attention to a man who had been stripped of his name, his past, everything that had made him human. And yet, There it was. That steady gaze, lingering just a moment too long, studying him as though he was more than just another starving prisoner waiting for his turn to vanish. The first time the officer spoke to him, my grandfather barely registered the words. His mind was too numb, his body too weak, and the language, German, sharp and foreign, slid over him like water he couldn't quite grasp. But then, something in the officer's tone changed. A question. A pause. A glance that, if my grandfather hadn't been so empty inside, might have felt almost expectant. "Where are you from?" It took him a second to answer. His throat was dry, and every instinct screamed that it was a trap. But something in the officer's face, something unreadable, made him answer. "Poland. And before this?" He hesitated. There was no before this. Not anymore. But something made him speak. "I was a husband. A father." The officer's expression didn't change, but the silence between them did. Maybe that was when it started. Days passed, and the officer, his rank was Rottenführer, my grandfather later learned, kept returning. He never stayed long, never asked questions that would raise suspicion, but he listened. Really listened. My grandfather told him about his wife, about the way she used to hum while kneading bread, about the way she smelled of flour and soap and something sweet he could never quite name. He told him about his son, about the first time the boy had gripped his finger, tiny and perfect, about the way his laughter had once filled their small home. And the officer, he listened like someone hearing a language he had never been taught. My grandfather didn't understand why. This man was the enemy. This man was part of the machine that had taken everything from him. And yet, there was something hollow in his eyes, something that made him look away whenever my grandfather spoke of love, of family, of the things that had made life worth living. Then, the small things began. An extra piece of bread. A shift in labor, away from the worst of the beatings. A brief glance, just long enough to say, "I see you." It wasn't kindness. My grandfather knew better than to call it that. But it was something. And in a place like Buchenwald, where humanity had been stripped to the bone, even the smallest flicker of recognition felt like a lifeline. But why? That was the question that gnawed at him. Why would a man who had been raised to believe in superiority, in power, in the crushing of the weak, suddenly take interest in a prisoner? What did he want? It wasn't until much later, when my grandfather was stronger, when the officer's visits had become almost routine, that he realized the truth. The officer had never known love. He had never had a wife to hum in the kitchen, never had a child to reach for his hand with innocent trust. He had been raised by a country that had taught him that duty was worth more than warmth, that strength was measured in control, that power was something to be taken, not given. And yet, here he was, standing in the cold, listening to a broken man speak of a life he could never have. Was it friendship? No. Friendship required equality, and there could never be equality between them. But maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Maybe it was loneliness. At first, my grandfather thought he had misheard. The officer had spoken quickly, his voice low, the words tumbling out as if they might dissolve before they reached the air. But when my grandfather looked at him, really looked, he saw the truth written across the man's face. Fear. The war was ending. The world outside the barbed wire had changed, though inside, time still crawled forward on broken legs. The guards had become quieter, their brutality more erratic, their certainty shaken. News traveled in whispers. Cities falling. Armies closing in. The mighty Reich, once unstoppable, now gasping for air like a wounded animal. The officer knew what happened to men like him when the war was lost. And he wasn't ready to die. The offer, if it could even be called that, was unthinkable. Switch identities. Take his uniform, his papers, his name. Walk out of this place as a man who had once held a gun instead of a shovel, a man who had commanded instead of obeyed. The weight of it was crushing. Could he do it? Could he put on the skin of the enemy, knowing what that uniform had meant, knowing what it had done? Could he step into the life of a man who had lived in comfort while he and so many others had starved? Could he walk away while those left behind, those without an escape, met their fate? Then again, what fate was left for him? He had been marked for transfer. A weapons factory. The final stop before death. Those who went rarely returned. The ones who did were too broken to tell their stories. So this was it. His choice. Live as another man, or die as himself. The officer was desperate. He said it would be simple. He had arranged it all. A change of records. A way out. My grandfather wouldn't even have to speak. Just walk when they told him to. Nod when they asked for his name. Leave this place wearing the face of the very man who had once stood above him. A year ago, a month ago, even a week ago, he would have spat at the idea. There were lines a man did not cross. There were things that should never be done. But starvation had a way of softening even the sharpest principles. He wanted to live. He wanted to see his wife again, hold his son, step onto soil that wasn't stained with blood and decay. So when the time came, when the uniform was pressed into his hands and the weight of it settled against his skin, he did not resist. He put it on. And just like that, he ceased to exist. The man who had entered this place, this prisoner, this father, this husband, was gone. In his place stood another.